Ukraine and Russia. The history of both countries dates back to the time of the Kievan Rus, a Slavic power founded by the Vikings more than 1,000 years ago around Kiev, the capital of present-day Ukraine. In fact, both Ukraine and Russia had their origins in the same country. The Kievan Rus is the origin of the country's name, Russia. In the 11th century, the Kievan Rus was one of the largest and most developed countries in medieval Europe. According to the ancient Greek Herodotus, the land of present-day Ukraine was inhabited by the Scythians, a nomadic tribe, around the 7th century BC. They were a belligerent people, and it seems that they used scorched earth tactics in battle. The Scythians would retreat while destroying towns and other structures, and then strike the enemy when they were exhausted and had nothing to gain. Later, the Ukrainian lands were used for scorched earth retreats against Napoleon's army and Nazi Germany. The Scythians, who were strong, lived a luxurious life, as evidenced by their burial accessories and burial mounds. And, ironically, as they became accustomed to a life of luxury, they became weaker as a fighting people. Then they were defeated and replaced by other peoples. However, since there are few burial remains, we do not seem to know the details of what kind of people they were. The Scythians were weakened and eventually the nomadic period ended, the agricultural culture began, and the Slavs conquered the Ukrainian lands. Ukraine has been targeted for territorial expansion by neighboring powers because of its fertile black soil, called Chernozems, and its good wheat harvest. Its exquisite location at the intersection of all nations and peoples also made it an easy target for invaders, and it was often involved in numerous conflicts. Around the 5th to 6th century, according to legend, a man named Chi and his brothers founded a city. It is said that the city was named Kiev, meaning city of Chi. Around the 9th century, there was a people called Vikings in northern Europe. The Vikings are thought of as pirates, but in reality, they were also engaged in fishing and trading. In the southern Mediterranean Sea, there was the powerful Eastern Roman Empire, the so-called Byzantine Empire, and its capital, Constantinople, was an important trading center connecting Europe and Asia. The Vikings crossed the Dnieper River to trade with Constantinople, and then via the Black Sea to reach Constantinople. They then traded with the Byzantine Empire. The Vikings settled along this river and began to conduct commerce. In 862, a man named Rurik, a member of the Viking tribe of the Rus people, founded the city of Novgorod. The descendants of Rurik reigned as rulers for about 1,000 years, from the Kievan Rus to the Russian Tsar in the 16th century. This is called the Rurik dynasty. A man named Oleg, who had served as regent after Rurik's death, captured a city on the Dnieper River, took Kiev, and founded the Kievan Rus. The state created by the Russians and Slavs was the Kievan Rus. Incidentally, Ukraine and Russia claim that the Kievan Rus is the origin of Ukraine and Russia, since they are states created by their own Slavic people. To the east of the Kievan Rus was a state called Khazar, which controlled the Volga River, which was also connected to the Kievan Principality. In order to seize the Volga River, an important trading post, the Kievan Rus attacked the Khazars. This weakened the Khazars. But it meant the loss of a bulwark against nomads from Asia. This led to the murder of the Grand Duke of Kiev by the nomads. The Grand Duke's sons fought for succession. The result was that the third son, Vladimir, won and ascended the throne as Grand Duke Vladimir I of Novgorod of the Kievan Rus. In the Byzantine Empire to the south, the country was in the midst of a domestic uprising. Vladimir deployed troops to support them. In return, he took the Byzantine emperor's daughter, Anna, as his wife. In 988, due to his proximity to the Byzantine Empire, Vladimir I, Prince of Novgorod of Kiev, converted to Christianity upon his marriage. He was baptized in the Crimean city of Chersonesos, a former ancient Greek colony. He also introduced Christianity as the state religion in the Kievan Rus. Since this baptism of Vladimir I, Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared that Russians and Ukrainians are one people and one people. After the death of Vladimir I, a succession struggle among his 12 sons ensued. The result was that Yaroslav won. Yaroslav, who acceded to the Grand Duchy throne, further expanded the territory of the Kievan Rus. In 1054, Christianity split into the Orthodox Church in Constantinople and the Catholic Church in Rome due to differences in religious beliefs and other factors. The Kievan Rus became Orthodox, while Poland, its neighbor to the west, became Catholic, leading to tension between the two countries. Yaroslav placed his sons in major cities around the country to keep them apart so that they would not fight over succession, and he placed them in major cities around the country to rule over each. The capital city, Kiev, was given to his eldest son to succeed him. However, contrary to Yaroslav's wishes, a succession struggle broke out after his death. This triggered a civil war that lasted for the next several centuries. Frustrated by the chaos in the country, citizens formed a civil society called Vech. It later became a rebel group. The rebels ousted the previous ruler in Novgorod and established themselves as the Novgorod Republic. In 1169, Vladimir Andrei Bogolyevsky, Grand Duke of Vladimir of the eastern part of the Kievan Rus, sacked and destroyed the capital city of Kiev in order to strengthen his own influence. This led to the downfall of the capital city of Kiev and the rise of Vladimir's position. At that time, Catholicism was an aggressive and exclusive force in Western Europe. Catholic forces organized a crusade to convert Northern European pagans to Christianity, crossed the North Sea, landed in Riga, the capital of present-day Latvia, and took control of the area. In the south, the Fourth Crusade was organized, but instead of going to Jerusalem, their original destination, they invaded and sacked Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was devastated, and the Kievan Rus lost an ally. Then, in 1223, the Mongols came from the east. The Kievan Rus intercepted them on the banks of the Kalka River, but was defeated. This is called the Battle of the Kalka River. The Kalka River is said to be the Kalichik River in present-day Ukraine. However, the Mongols did not invade the Kievan Rus, but moved northward and tried to conquer the Volga Bulgarian state, which was located east of the Kievan Rus, but failed. They then withdrew back to Mongolia. At that time, the Kievan Rus felt more threatened by the Catholic powers than by the Mongols. In Mongolia to the east, Ogedei Khan built his capital, Karakorum. He then organized an army with Tatar tribes and began another expedition to Europe. The Mongols quickly expanded their territory with a large cavalry force and an invasion using bows. The policy was to spare lives if they surrendered early, but to thoroughly destroy them if they resisted. In 1240, the Mongols from the east invaded the Kievan Rus. The Mongols also invaded Poland and Hungary, causing tremors throughout Europe. At the end of 1241, with the death of Ogedei Khan, the invasion stopped the following year. After the death of Ogedei Khan, the western part of the Mongol Empire established an autonomous government as the Ulus of Joshi, with Sarai near the Caspian Sea as its capital. The ruins of Sarai are in present-day Russia. The Kievan Rus was ruled by the Mongol Empire, but was granted a certain status and autonomy by paying tribute. The Mongol Empire was also tolerant of religion, which was freely practiced. The Mongol Empire left the culture intact as long as tribute was paid, so Ukrainian Christian culture was completed under the rule of the Mongol Empire. The prefecture bishop of the Kievan Rus was located in the capital city of Kiev, but moved to Vladimir as Kiev fell into disrepair. Under the rule of the Mongol Empire, the Kievan Rus was gradually divided into a number of princely states. One of them was the Principality of Moscow. This led to what is now Russia. The Grand Duchy of Moscow was established in Moscow, near Vladimir, and the prefecture bishop was moved to the capital, Moscow. In the west, Lithuania grew in power and gradually conquered the territory of the former Kievan Rus. Lithuania then grew to become the largest power in Europe. The Grand Duchy of Moscow and the allied forces of the several Rus principalities rebelled against the Ulus of Joshi and defeated the Mongol Tatar army at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. In 1386, Lithuania married the queen of neighboring Poland to the west and converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. The Grand Duchy of Moscow gradually annexed the surrounding principalities and states, expanding its prince and improving its position. Meanwhile, the Ulus of Joshi suffered internal dissension and declined. In 1453, Constantinople was invaded by the Ottoman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire, which had existed for more than 1,000 years, was destroyed. Grand Duke Ivan III of the Grand Duchy of Moscow proclaimed Moscow the capital of the Orthodox Church as the headquarters of the Orthodox Church, replacing Constantinople, which had been destroyed and ruled by an Islamic state. The Grand Duchy of Moscow finally refused to pay tribute to the Ulus of Joshi, and in 1480, a standoff ensued on the banks of the Ugla River. However, the Mongols withdrew without a fight in the face of the increasingly powerful Moscow. This is called the Great Stand on the Ugla River. The Ugla River is a river in what is now Western Russia. This was the occasion for the Grand Duchy of Moscow to break free from the Mongol Empire's domination. Vasily III, who succeeded Grand Duke Ivan III, further expanded his prince. He was succeeded by Grand Duke Ivan IV, who was crowned Tsar in 1547. He also changed the name of the country from Grand Duchy of Moscow to the Tsardom of Russia. The name Tsar is a Slavicized version of the Roman imperial title Caesar, which means emperor. Ivan IV occupied the Kazan Khanate in the east and the Astra Khanate in the south. In 1586, he financed the Cossack Yermak to explore Siberia. Russia then expanded into our region. In 1598, Fyodor I died without a successor. This marked the end of the Rurik dynasty, which had lasted about 1,000 years since Rurik I. The Russian Tsarate entered a period of turmoil as the crown was fought over, but eventually Mikhail Romanov, who was related to the Rurik dynasty, ascended to the Tsarship. This was the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which lasted until the Russian Revolution. The Ukrainian lands were invaded and divided by Poland and Lithuania from the west in the 16th century. And it was at this time that the place name Ukraine appeared. Meanwhile, Moscow gradually rose to prominence, and conversely, Kiev's status declined. In Ukraine, they took up arms to defend themselves during their rule. This armed group was called the Cossacks. Then, in the 17th century, a leader emerged from among them named Khmelnytsky. He began to fight against Poland. However, the Kingdom of Poland was a powerful country at that time, so he had a hard time and asked for help from Russia, which was rising at that time. With that, he began to be protected by Russia. And the Cossacks gradually came under the control of Moscow. Russia fought against Sweden, the Nordic power at that time. This is called the Great Northern War. The Russian Tsarate changed the name of the country to the Russian Empire during the reign of Peter I. It seems that Russia believed that Russia was the legitimate successor to the Russian Empire. In contrast, the Ukrainian view seems to be that Russia is different because it is a side state of the Kievan Rus and has a different culture. In the 17th century, a war between the Polish-Lithuanian republics and the Russian Empire brought Kiev and the area east of the Dnieper River under Russian imperial rule. West of the Dnieper River was controlled by Poland. In the 18th century, as Poland weakened, the area west of the Dnieper River was annexed to the Russian Empire in 1793-95. In Ukraine, the Russification policy prohibited the learning and use of the Ukrainian language. In addition, the country was forced to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. Furthermore, the Austrian Empire later took control of the Galicia region, and 20% of the country was divided and ruled by the Austrian Empire and 80% by the Russian Empire. Russia, wishing to control the Black Sea, went to war with the Ottoman Empire in 1853. This was the Crimean War. However, Russia was defeated because Britain and France supported the Ottoman Empire. The war made Russia keenly aware that Britain and France were developing their technology through the Industrial Revolution. Russia also began to pursue industrialization and the spread of railroads. As a result of rapid industrialization, poor working conditions were created. The gap between the rich and poor workers and exploiting capitalists, widened. This would later lead to the Russian Revolution. World War I pitted Britain, France, and Russia against Germany and Austria. This led to two separate battles in the Ukrainian lands. In Russia, the war was costly and workers' discontent finally exploded during the war, leading to the Russian Revolution led by the Bolsheviks under Lenin. Bolshevik means majority. Free commerce widens the gap. Therefore, the state takes the initiative in producing goods and distributes them equally to all in a mechanical way. This would be a good society for everyone. This was the communist idea that tried to overthrow the capitalists. The Russian Revolution overthrew the imperial regime and Ukraine tried to gain independence. However, the Bolsheviks refused to recognize it. The Bolsheviks did not recognize Ukraine's independence because of its agriculture and its strategic location on the Black Sea. Ukraine lost the battle against the Bolsheviks and failed to gain independence. It is said that Ukraine failed to gain independence because it lacked a charismatic leader. Russia had overwhelming leaders such as Peter I and Lenin, who prevented them from doing so. And in Ukraine, a new government was born with the breath of the Bolsheviks. Around Russia, in addition to Ukraine, several other new governments have sprung up with the breath of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks themselves took the lead in uniting these countries and established a new country. This was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. In 1922, Ukraine became a constituent of the Soviet Union. In 1924, Lenin of the Soviet Union died. He was succeeded by Joseph Stalin. In the 1930s, Stalin sought to industrialize and expand agricultural production in order to strengthen the country. For agriculture, he promoted collective farming. Until then, each individual farmer had been forced to work in state-controlled collective farms. However, confusion ensued and it did not work. Furthermore, in order to sell the harvested grain abroad and earn foreign currency, even the harvest necessary for daily life was collected, which led to millions of Ukrainians being driven to starvation and many deaths. Stalin then emigrated many Soviet citizens, including Russians, to make up for the rural population of Ukraine. Then comes World War II. Nazi German troops invaded the Soviet Union and massacred Ukrainian Jews. Stalin launched a scorched earth campaign against the Nazi invasion. This led to the scorched earth nature of Ukrainian cities. Thus, Ukraine became the front line in the war between Germany and the Soviet Union, and was devastated by looting and destruction. Toward the end of World War II, British Prime Minister Churchill, American President Roosevelt, and Soviet President Stalin held talks at Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine about what to do after the war. This is the Yalta Conference. After the end of World War II, the Cold War breaks out between the Western nations led by the US and the Eastern nations led by the Soviet Union. The United States and other Western nations united to create an organization to defend any one country against the Soviet Union, and if any one country was attacked, they would all defend that country. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The Soviet Union, in order to counter NATO, created a similar organization to that of the Eastern countries. It is the Warsaw Pact organization. The Eastern countries followed the Soviet Union's lead and adopted socialism, where all companies were owned and managed by the state, and the state controlled the type, quantity, and price of all products produced. This had the advantage of being able to produce what was needed all at once. However, since everything that is produced is designated, and furthermore, there is no competition, companies do not pursue what the people really want or appropriate prices. As a result, the economy stagnated and the people's lives became more difficult. Some Eastern countries were dissatisfied with this and moved against it. However, they have been suppressed by force of arms. Even under such circumstances, they developed and produced nuclear weapons and other weapons in order to compete with the US. As a result, the lives of citizens became increasingly difficult. The planned economy came to a standstill and the country became economically exhausted. In 1985, Gorbachev, who became the leader of the Soviet Union, felt a sense of crisis about the future of the Soviet Union and implemented perestroika. Perestroika means rebuilding. In 1986, an accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The information was concealed and did not reach Gorbachev immediately. As a result, the residents of the area were not evacuated and were exposed to radiation. This led Gorbachev to conduct glasnost. Glasnost means disclosure of information. He also urged the Eastern countries to decide their own affairs in their own countries. As a result, revolutions broke out in the Eastern countries and their governments were overthrown. The Eastern group of countries virtually collapsed. The Soviet Union, too, reassessed its relations with the West, and the Cold War, which had lasted 44 years, came to an end. In addition, Yeltsin made the Russian Republic independent from the stalled Soviet Union. Following this trend, other countries that made up the Soviet Union, such as Belarus, became fully independent, and in August 1991, Ukraine also gained independence from the Soviet Union. In December 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the countries that had made up the Soviet Union began to think about their own security. Without the backing of a major power, they wondered what they would do in the event of civil war in their own countries or if they became involved in conflicts in surrounding countries. To solve this problem, they began to seek to join NATO. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO lost its raison d'etre, and the purpose of its activities became the stability of Europe and the suppression of conflicts, and for NATO, too, the expansion of its sphere of activity was favorable for its strength and the maintenance of stability, so it accepted the Eastern countries. From Russia's point of view, however, this means that its former allies in the East are now joining NATO, which was its adversary during the Cold War, and are moving their power closer to that of Russia. This made them wary of NATO and the United States. However, NATO could not protest because it had the cause of maintaining peace in Europe. Nor could it stop the Eastern powers from making their move. However, there were a few countries that Russia just could not approve of the move. Russia's vast territory makes border security a challenge. Therefore, it would like to have a pro-Russian state or a neutral country as a cushion for its neighbors. Therefore, if Ukraine joins NATO, a large part of its borders will be in contact with its former adversary NATO. That would be a major risk to Russia's national security. And in April 2008, NATO finally committed to Ukraine's future membership in NATO. In response, President Putin declared his readiness to take military action against NATO enlargement. Within Ukraine, however, the East and the West were divided on NATO membership. Eastern Ukraine, which has been under Russian control since earlier times than the West, has stronger ties to Russia and a large Russian population and businesses, which tend to support more Russian-leaning leaders. In Western Ukraine, people tend to support European-leaning leaders because of the country's history under European rule, including Austria and Poland, and its proximity to NATO member countries. Religion also differs between East and West, with the Russian-speaking Russian Orthodox Church predominating in the eastern part of the country. The western part of the country, on the other hand, has a large Ukrainian-speaking Catholic Church congregation. Because of these circumstances, many in western Ukraine were in favor of NATO membership. Conversely, the majority of eastern Ukraine was opposed to NATO membership. In 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych refused to cooperate with European countries and moved closer to Russia, which led to demonstrations in the country. It developed into riots and the president fled the country. Later, Ukraine got a European-leaning president, but this time, demonstrations took place mainly in the eastern part of the country. In February 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which had been one of the sites of the demonstrations, under the guise of protecting the Russians in the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula was overrun, and a referendum was held on the Crimean Peninsula to determine whether the peninsula would become part of Russia under Russian leadership, with a majority in favor. Based on the results, President Putin annexed the Crimean Peninsula to Russia. Russia leased land on the Crimean Peninsula and had military bases there. If Ukraine joined NATO and became a fully Western-oriented country, it could no longer use the bases on the Crimean Peninsula. To prevent this, Russia is said to have invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Subsequently, demonstrations in the region adjacent to Russia in eastern Ukraine led to conflict, with Russia providing support to pro-Russian groups. In 2021, a large military presence was confirmed along Russia's border with Ukraine. Russia stated that it did not intend to invade militarily. However, it insisted to the US and NATO that Ukraine not be included in NATO, that NATO not be expanded any further, that missiles not be deployed in countries close to Russia, and that US and NATO troops in Eastern European countries be withdrawn. The US and NATO sides argued that there was room for discussion on the placement of missiles, that Ukraine was free to decide what group it belonged to, and that Russia would withdraw its troops and relieve tensions. In February 2022, Russia recognized the pro-Russian groups as the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic as states in the disputed territory in eastern Ukraine. Furthermore, military action was taken under the guise of protecting the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic from Ukraine, a Western-leaning state. Russia's military action is to protect these recognized countries, not to attack Ukraine, and is a peaceful action, according to Russia's argument. In response to this Russian move, Ukraine declared a state of emergency and requested assistance from the West. Russia invaded Ukraine and here we are. President Putin is said to be an avid reader of history. Russia has been invaded by Europe several times in its history, including Napoleon's invasion of Russia and Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in violation of the Non-Aggression Pact. As a result, President Putin is said to have an image of European countries as untrustworthy. Furthermore, Putin suffered the collapse of the Soviet Union when he was posted to East Germany as a candidate for a senior position in the KGB, and European countries are said to have an image of Putin as the country that brought down the Great Soviet Union.